This is the Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850, your Venn diagram. You see at the top here, the standard is to be able to find similarities, which means same, and differences, different, between texts in the treatment and scope of ideas. So the two texts being pieces of law, one, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, and one, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, passed by Congress. Okay, so you're looking at what each of them contain, the similarities and differences. Okay, make sure you have your heading in the upper right hand corner, name, class, period, date. This is actually language arts. Period and date. Okay, now for the directions. Venn diagram. A Venn diagram usually shows visually, sorry, let me start over. A Venn diagram shows visually how two things are similar and different. The diagram is simply two intersecting ovals or circles, or clumps in my version, but it'll do. When the two things have a trait in common, write that trait in the area where the two circles intersect. So that's this part right here. If a trait belongs to only one of the two things, write it in the part of the circle that does not intersect with the other circle. So this one or this one. Compare and contrast the Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850 by filling out the Venn diagram below. Okay, so I'm going to do this one with you. We're going to take some notes, so we are good to go the next couple of days. 1793. So this act that happened, it rewarded people, gave $500. I shouldn't say rewarded people, it was a fine. So if you were protecting a fugitive, if you were protecting a runaway slave, you had to pay $500. Remember, fugitive, a slave that leaves its owner, his or her owner, is considered a fugitive, someone who's running away. So that's one. Also, that was terrible. Let me start over. An owner could claim a fine against anyone protecting a fugitive. So in 1793, you did not want to be someone who was harboring or housing a slave, a former slave. As for the 1850 law, this 1850 law made it more damaging, more stringent, more strict on what you could and couldn't do. This gave federal commissioners the power to arrest and return fugitives. Federal commissioners are people that are put in charge of particular things, usually having to do with the law. And so people could, that were given this job, could come into your city or state and arrest and return fugitives. Also, there's a $1,000 fine for any marshal. I'm going to write outside the line here, and I'd encourage you to do the same. There's a law on this one in 1850. Fine for any marshal, oops, just one L, refusing to serve a warrant. Remember we talked about warrants early on in this year. You needed a warrant in order to make an arrest or to search a home, things like that. So the court needed to tell you that you would be able to do something. And so if a marshal or police officer basically refused to serve a warrant, refused to arrest somebody, then they would have to pay $1,000 fine. Now you might say, oh, $1,000, 500, no big deal. But back then, this was a hefty price for people to pay. That today rent is $500, but back then, that's probably rent for a year. So it was a much bigger deal to pay this amount of money. Also, a marshal is also responsible or held responsible for any escape of fugitives. So say a fugitive is staying in this marshal's jail and escapes, the marshal is held responsible. Also in 1850, this law said that citizens could not refuse to serve on groups to hunt fugitives. This is called deputized. Deputized. That means if someone needed to, say a police officer was running down, trying to track a slave down and running after him or her, they could turn to you as a citizen and say, I deputize you to hunt this person down with me. And you would have to do it. You could not refuse. If you refused, it was punishable by arrest or fine. Also, we have two more here. $1,000 fine for interfering with any arrest of a fugitive. And then the big one here, slaves who crossed to the north were no longer considered free. So before, if they had crossed into the north and they were living somewhere else, they gained their freedom. But slave owners in the South didn't like that. They felt like those slaves were property to them and that they deserved to get them back. So the law of 1850 changed a lot of things. The Fugitive Slave Acts, though, did have some things in common. I'm going to write a couple things here. First, it was illegal to help a fugitive from slavery. So what Harriet Tubman did and many others when they went down to the plantations and helped people sneak out and sneak up to the north and into Canada. Also the conductors on the railroad, also the station masters, the people that housed the slaves at their house, that was illegal, what they were doing. Also, for both laws, all runaways had to be captured and returned. And this was on the books in 1793, but it wasn't so much enforced until the law of 1850.